Okay, so thank you for the introduction. And it's my pleasure to be a part of this very engaging conference. Thank you to the organizers and also to the audience, without which you can't have a conference. I'm going to talk about orphan drugs in terms of an evolving landscape. I've been in this space for a while now. Um, and I'll begin with just a general overview of what you can expect in the orphan drug space. There are over 7,000 diseases affecting nearly 350 million and rising population worldwide. And amazingly, out of these 7,000 diseases, there are only about 10% of the population that, just about 10% of these rare diseases where there is an FDA approved human medicinal product. So you can see that it is still underserved, and it's disproportionate effort in terms of R&D spend and commercialization. It affects less than 200,000 because that's by definition what an orphan is. A lot of the underpinnings of orphans lie in the genetic aspect. And this population is truly underserved despite an increasing trend, which I'll get to in a minute. And they're expensive to develop because of these small populations, very targeted populations. In some cases, they are clusters here and there that one needs to pick on. And there are more than 40 orphan drugs that exceed $1 billion in global sales. So that really tells you that it's not true to say that in the orphan indications, we may not have a blockbuster drug. It's quite to the contrary. These are, I call them as niche blockbusters in the orphan drug space. And there's a lot of innovation that goes into expansion within an orphan space, indication expansion within the subgroups. There are 250 new rare diseases identified each year, and worldwide, the market is at around $127 billion as of 2018, growing at 11% CAGR per year through 2024. And you can compare that to non-orphans, around 6%. So it puts the perspective and the focus on orphan drugs and why this is a space which is rapidly growing. So the next I'd like to talk about is on the Orphan Drug Act, which provides the legal basis for designation and status provisions. ODA confers certain incentives and tax credits in the rare disease and ultra rare disease space, both in the adult and pediatric subsets, which are based on the rate of being less than 200,000. You get market application, the prescription drug user fee being exempted, but there are no exemptions when it comes to standard regulatory requirements, dare I say. FDA Policy Council has set up now an orphan drug modernization plan, which has a scope that stretches from providing reviews on designation and how you go about indicating your indication, and all the way to rare pediatric disease priority review vouchers, referred to as RPD, PRVs. It also incentivizes in terms of orphan exclusivity, and we'll get into it in a bit, and other guidance. And there are also aspects where if you're not in the pediatric space, you could get a waiver also as part of the incentives. Orphan drug designation grant criteria. So let's review that next. In order for one to be eligible, one has to demonstrate that the asset under development is likely to prevent, diagnose, or treat the condition being targeted. So the rare disease space, you could be in an overall population or you could be in a subpopulation. So a population within a population. And they're often referred to as orphan subsets. Hence, I was saying initially, when you get to the point of demarcating a niche blockbuster, you would plan your development and regulatory and commercial strategy in such a way that you can keep going with additional indications. Rare disease in pediatric population could be different from the adults in some ways. And the example I would give is sickle cell disease, because we are developing a product in that space. The FDA modernization plan will address all the backlogs because so far this area has suffered from a backlog. And I think it's mostly taken care of by September 2019, last year. And now it's all about adherence to a 90-day review timeline via the collaboration between CDER, CBER, and OPT. And this all started in June 2017. So it's been all good for orphan developers. Let's now look at the FDA incentive programs, and there are many grant programs available which cater to roughly $14 million per year. And per grant, you can go up, from what I've been able to glean through, $200,000 to $400,000 per year for 3 to 4 years program. And after that, you would be in the recompete process, supporting clinical data, and it's open to all. Another example is in recent period, core clinical outcomes assessment grant programs, which are led by CDER. They've come into play. And the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator, as it's referred to as, data analytics platform has also now been created, which is referred to as RDCA, DAP, and DAP. What this is a collaboration between the FDA and the CPATH Institute. It's a public-private collaboration. And it has introduced this analytics platform, which is funded in a way that it runs through a centralized and standardized infrastructure, and it supports all the rare disease area in terms of characterization with the goal of drug development across the rare disease platform. You could learn more about it by simply looking at RDCA hyphen DAP. And it's meant to remove bottlenecks in terms of information, in terms of sharing patient level data. And I think you heard a lot about how technology is helping improve the patient centricity. So this is another example of how patient level data, which is structured and standardized, can enable us to design our trials appropriately. And it can help in limiting the sources of variability. As most of us in rare diseases, we know that our biggest challenge apparently is in controlling variability in order to optimize the characterizations of subpopulations in this area. So I would urge everyone to, if they have an opportunity, to look into this further. The other incentives are in tax credits, which cover about 50% of the clinical trial costs. There's, of course, the use of fee waiver, which I mentioned before, and the exclusivity for 7 years. And then there is the Rare Pediatric Disease Voucher Program, which is the main attraction. And a decision usually happens within 6 months after filing. So instead of the usual 10 months. And RPD candidates are eligible for PRV, which is the voucher that gives the value add to rare disease R&D. It is transferable. So we've got one product in the market, colic acid targeted, and we were able to, due to reasons, move this candidate and the PRV to another sponsor. But you have to notify the FDA of intent at least 90 days prior to redemption of the voucher. So that's the condition. There are other strategic options available in the orphan drug development space. And I'm listing some here. The GAIN Act, for instance, which applies to antimicrobials and antifungals under the QIDP, Qualified Infectious Disease Product Designation. It gives access or eligibility for priority review and fast track designation, and that provides additional 5 years of exclusivity. The fast track designation is another option, and it accelerates the new drug development by virtue of a rolling review. It does require supportive non-clinical data. And then lastly, the breakthrough designation, based on its definition of treating a serious life-threatening condition and showing substantial improvement on one or more clinical endpoints compared to standard of care. You can use this, the surrogates or the intermediates to demonstrate clinical benefit, even in a BTD environment. The Rare Disease Cures Accelerator helps in supporting innovation and quality in rare disease drug development. So that's something I touched on earlier. FDA is very considered and diligent in launching into this space so that it can inform rare disease development, because you can't waste a patient population regardless of traditional or rare disease, but in rare disease, you're going to lose much more, as you've got to be very, very focused on accruing your patient population. And furthermore, the rare disease conditions tend to be showing a great amount of heterogeneity. And through this portal, one can look into ways in which you can understand disease progression. So let's take the example of the often talked about COVID-19. When you have an evolving landscape of any given disease, even if you were to have real world evidence, it's going to be pretty limited in terms of establishing cost burden, treatment burden, etc. So I think it's a given that based on registries and based on these private public databases, one can benefit from a protocol that bears context to how the disease progresses and choosing your endpoints thereof. Now let's look at the trends amongst orphans, expedited, and rare trends. And you see here in this slide, it's a little off color, I guess, but it conveys the impression that as we move from 2014 over to 2018, you can see that the orphan drug status being granted, an expedited review status being granted, that's kind of more or less keeping at a constant level. But the number of rare diseases have gone up considerably. It's an uprising trend here. Next, I'd like to show you some interesting data on worldwide orphan drug sales going from 2018 to 24. And this is the top 12 companies in this space. So on the left-hand side of this slide, you see the company name. And then next to that column shows you the 2024 leading orphan products that these companies have. And the key message here is to look at the double-digit CAGR growth from 18 to 24 in this space. Well, 1/5 of worldwide prescription sales are orphans. And the challenge we have in this space is the pricing, the reimbursement part of it. And let's take the recent example of Luxturna, which is $425,000 per eye. And there was an uproar initially, and there's a lot of back and forth negotiations on this drug. The mean cost per patient per year of the top 100 orphans, it's around $150,000, and that's in 2018, versus around $33,000 for non-orphans. So pricing and reimbursement is a matter which requires companies in this space to look at all data sources that can help in preparing the treatment landscape and the cost burden thereof very early on, instead of doing it near market. Strategic considerations in orphan drug space. Partner early with the FDA, ideally go for a SPA, special protocol assessment, by applying to the OOPT. And the submission can be an NDA or a BLA. On the clinical development program requirements to support registration, you could be comforted by the fact that there's an expedited development path. And it typically involves much smaller population in phase 3 as compared to traditional drug development. You have a shorter regulatory review time, more likely to receive an approval. And but the requirements are very similar. You have to still prove your safety, efficacy, and to a great extent, not prove, but it's always helpful to have health economic data. So I would strongly recommend when you're doing orphan drug development, you should have health economic endpoints built into the late stage development program. And technology can help you in all of that, because in some cases, it's patient-reported outcomes, the patient centricity is playing a strong role, so you could use PROs which are validated and accepted by the agency. It will help in through regulatory planning to reduce the time and cost of development. So I think a lot of the information in this slide comparing European experience versus the US on legal basis, prevalence, incentives, exclusivity, timeline, and procedure, I think is known to a lot of the audience here, I guess. But it's laid out in a summary here, and the main point to focus on is that there's clearly a difference in the US 7 years exclusivity versus 10 years exclusivity in the European market. And definitionally, you can see there's a difference in prevalence. 5 in 10,000 is the definition in EU, and fewer than 200,000 in the US. Timelines are 90-day with COMP and a 30-day EC, European Commission. No timelines given here in the US, but it tends to be around 1 to 3 months. Europeans have a centralized procedure, so one submission across European member states. So when preparing a global regulatory and marketing strategy, it's on the regulatory front, it helps to know how you're going to sequence these submissions. And on the marketing front, it's important to know how you're going to address the HTAs. The HTAs, the health technology assessors, on the European market, they are much more complex, but it's becoming increasingly similar globally with the requirements in the US of value dossiers, the MCP dossiers and the like. So here are some of the European development considerations. You should have a pre-submission meeting with the COMP. Apply early in development life cycle in order for you to gain on the incentives. Get scientific advice as early as possible. And you're eligible for all the fee reductions for marketing authorization, application, and maintenance. Grants and tax reductions, and 10-year market exclusivity with some pricing advantages. Pricing and reimbursement is in an art form in the European side, comparatively speaking, because there are annuity-based payments, 3-year, then you come back with additional data to support renegotiations and pricing. So it's a moving target right now. So what I say today might not be applicable in 2 years' time. The accelerated pathway, the review time is about 150 days, so it's come down from 210. And it applies to major health interest therapies. You should request for a marketing authorization application 2 to 3 months before doing that. And pre-submission meetings with the European Medicine Agency are always helpful, at least 6 months before submission. So everything has to happen early. There's a program in Europe called PRIME, which confers priority. And so you could read about it online. Some challenges in moving through the drug development process, I've tried to put it in 2 categories. One, scientific, regulatory, and legal, and the other is the operational piece. This is high level. So there is a possibility to condense the timelines in rare diseases. We're doing that, for example, using an adaptive trial design. Within adaptive considerations, it's not just applicable to pick the winner arm, but you could also have response adaptive designs. You could have seamless designs moving from phase 1, 2 to 3, and then with real world evidence as your post-market commitments. It's very important these days to include a very well-described health economic outcome research plan. And in order for us to be able to convey useful information which can be modeled, which can create forecasts and be part of a predictive analytics program that can then help in driving the market expansion and pricing discussions. It needs to also bear context to having validated clinical endpoints. And we build IP strategy, it goes without saying, whilst you're in process. But the SAP has to be pre-planned. These days, most agencies, because there is a temptation in difficult to treat areas. If you don't hit your primary, then I think you look for subgroups. But more and more, the ask from the agencies is, what was your intent? Is this pre-planned? Otherwise, post hoc is looked at as in a negative light in terms of cherry picking. Sometimes it's operational reasons that can be drawn into play, saying that this was a challenge in terms of disease progression was not so clear at the time, practice standards were not clear at the time, etc. But I think it's a struggle nonetheless if you don't have pre-planned analysis. And so on the rest of it is all academic, I think, in terms of pub planning and QL development and preparing your launch plan. You just have to be a little bit more smarter when it comes to orphans in how you sequence an orphan in one country may not really work in another region or other country. And in some cases, there are subpopulations that may be more prevalent in one region than the other. On the operational side, as you can see, I'm just going to touch on patient engagement because a lot of the talks prior to this were one way or another trying to invite attention to how engaging with the targeted patient population is extremely important. And it is becoming even more so with the COVID-19 impacts lately. Recruitment and retention has been a challenge for most companies, particularly in rare disease, because this population is having pre-existing serious conditions. And on top of it, if they were to sustain COVID-19 infection, a lot of things could be more challenging. We're seeing contextual issues like canceled appointments, job losses, loss of health insurance, which are also reasons that are leading to delayed start of new trials. We heard a lot today of virtual platforms, and I agree with the previous presenters. Shaheen was talking about the projection of how virtual platform is likely to become center stage as time moves on. And I think it's through that experience that we're going to learn how to economize as well on delivering products, both in terms of cost and time. We have also experienced IMP supply chain interruptions, which can also have a negative impact on trial progress. And then I'll leave it to you to look into expanded access and right to try, because again, in rare disease spaces, there is a significant conversation to be had, whether it's a good thing to have an expanded access, or if a drug is still in development, should you be having an expanded access program, right to try, or should you be concerned about pricing and therefore leave it till later? So there are some medical commercial perspectives, market access strategy, health economics. I've already touched on that. So, it's important to have roadmaps built into briefing books, which you're going to use as your tool for negotiations. that are all centered on prospective and retrospective real-world data studies. And then bringing forth value-based communications to payers, providers, and patients. So I'm on my last slide, and this is the optimized pathway. In a summary, looking at pre-IND, IND, and moving on to post-market period. And try to show you what are the activities which one needs to focus on when optimization is your focus area. So getting scientific advice in pre-IND stage, obtaining protocol assistance and ensuring that if there are any natural history studies to be done, they're done early. And that information is used for trial design in development stages, phase 1 to 3. And looking at testing your protocols, there's always a benefit in risk assessing your protocol, even before launching and implementing it. I've found that very useful. And then keeping a focus of key risk indicators. Identified key risk indicators should be your driver in ensuring optimization of the development pathway. So with that, this is where we are located in Baltimore. Our building is right in the bottom right-hand corner, and we have a beautiful harbor view here. So thank you very much, and open to any questions.
Okay, thank you, Gurdyal. It's a very interesting presentation. We do have one question for you. Question comes from Ronald, and it's, with all of the developments in digital health and artificial intelligence tools, are you expecting dramatic changes in the regulatory and reimbursement frameworks over the next few years?
And that's a very, very interesting question. And my response to that is that in the pricing reimbursement side, I think we're more than likely to see machine learning playing a part and providing simulation tools for forecasting and making projections. But in the development side, I'm not too sure because we have specific endpoints, a lot of the surrogates markers that we use. There's not enough data in the rare disease space to, because the AI or machine learning in one form or another is dependent on the amount of data that you input. So I think that's the limitation, and over time, I can't predict, but I think there's going to be some time before it plays a key role. Maybe some parts of a trial, example, imaging or biomarkers, if you have them, if you have enough data, you could use some of these tools.
You make a good point about AI and what's put in, because AI does not allow for serendipity, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, well, we don't have any other questions, Gurdyal, so thank you very much for your presentation. And
thank you.
It was very well done, and we appreciate that.
Thank you.
And we have now